Today's Parsha podcast is sponsored by our dear friend, Dr. Gary Friedlander, in memory of his mother, Dottie Friedlander. May her memory be a blessing. In Parshat Eikev, Moshe imparts on us some key lessons of the Torah. And while the Torah normally loves to give us specific details to follow, here Moshe gives us an overarching principle. He tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 10, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God demand of you? Only this, to revere the Lord your God, to walk only in God's paths, to love God and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, keeping the Lord's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today for your good." While it's simple and memorable enough to know that God's demands are straightforward, what really matters is getting on the right path, the path of justice. Moshe makes sure we also understand the gravity of that obligation. We read, "For the Lord your God is God supreme and Lord supreme, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, but upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing God with food and clothing. You too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." The balance of God's compassion and extreme concern for the vulnerable can feel like almost a contrast to the depictions of God's might and severity. Especially given debates and discourses in America, we tend to ask whether God is loving or vengeful, kind or powerful. But the Torah illustrates for us that the moral passion of God in the Bible does not lend itself well to these binaries. Justice is not about being only merciful or only strong. It requires imbuing strength within mercy and mercy within strength. And this is the example that God sets for us to follow. So too, Torah shows us that we are to be humble before God's power, and we should be using our power for justice. We should love God, and we should be loving like God. I feel that most of the moral dilemmas in my life revolve around navigating this tension between, as the Kabbalists put it, chesed and gevura, loving kindness and judgment, strength. Living a good life is not just about being the kindest or the most powerful. It's about knowing when to be strong and when to be soft, when to be firm in our principles and when to be flexible, when to be hawkish and when to be dovish, when to do the minimum and when to go above and beyond the law. We famously read in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, "A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven. A time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace." One way we can read this poem is that it is telling us there are specific times for each way of being. But when we get down to the granular details, life often demands us to these seeming opposites all at once. Being a loving parent can mean that we must be strict. Fighting a war for justice can often mean also taking care of seeming enemies compassionately. One of the reasons why it's so challenging to pin down God's personality in the Torah is it depicts God reacting to many different people in many different circumstances. The instructions that were meant for Moshe here or Sarah there inform our morality, but they don't dictate it. God doesn't teach us one simple lesson. We learn that all of our lives, there are moral challenges to navigate uniquely. The balance of virtues needed at a specific challenge in a specific moment are provided not by the Torah's ideology, but by the Torah's wisdom. For a lot of religiously inclined people today, the depictions of God that instill fear are so overwhelming that it's easy to forget the complexity altogether, and we often want to leave religion altogether. What then is the right understanding of these passages of fear, ones that don't seem to be in line with our peak experiences of God's presence? The first Chabad Rebbe wrote in his work, the Tanya, "It does not soar on high through love alone, just as a bird cannot fly with one wing, for fear and love are the two wings. Similarly, fear alone is but one wing, and one's service cannot ascend on high with it, although it is termed the service of a servant, for there must also be the filial quality in order to awaken at least the natural love that is hidden in his heart, to become conscious of it in his mind at any rate, to be aware of his love of the one God in his thought and desire to cleave to him, blessed be he." We're all human. We can all remember times when we didn't feel like doing the right thing, but external pressure compelled us to do it anyways. Perhaps after that happened and we were made to stay on the right track, that momentum made it easier to do good deeds purely because we wanted to. When we understand the Torah this way, we see that God doesn't necessarily crave trembling. Rather, the trembling can be a wake-up call for getting us to live in a way that is conducive to justice, to lives of love. One of the things that makes God so awesome is precisely the ability to hold all these seemingly contradictory emotions and commitments together. Perhaps human potential lies in our ability to aspire toward that trait as well. As Walt Whitman put it in his song, Song of Myself, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." But how can we strive to be complex in a way that is truly elevating rather than just mercurial or erratic? Maybe rather than seeing contradictions as polar opposites, we can choose to make one aspect a verb and the other aspect an adjective. For example, a teacher can enforce an elaborate set of rules, but those individual rules can be flexible. It's amazing to me that what God demands of us is not that we be perfectly moral beings, but that we walk in God's ways, following God's moral model. The problem with simple all-or-nothing demands is that once we fail, we've fallen off. Walking in God's ways, what we might call halakha, however, has teshuvah, repentance, built into the system. Once we've failed, we know that the only thing to do is get back onto the right path. The key command in this Parsha is later rephrased by the prophet Micha, who tells us, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk modestly with your God. Then will your name achieve wisdom." I like the way this phrasing doesn't tell us to be like God, but to walk with God. Even if there is a set path, following it can be lonely. One key tactic for fighting against that, though, is a God consciousness that tells us we're in fact not the center of the universe. We are not walking in the world alone. So too, justice is not about God ruling completely independently of us. Most ancient societies would see the gods as determining what life will be like in a way that diverts responsibility away from the people. The Torah, however, insists that God's rule comes from people building it. In ancient times, that meant the people physically constructing an ark or a tabernacle or a temple. Today, we build God's dwelling place with the mitzvot we do. We cannot bank on finding redemption in an arbitrarily bestowed gift of mercy from above. The Torah teaches us how to be God's walking partner. It teaches us that the work of bringing about justice requires us meeting God halfway, so to speak. In my opinion, one profound way of reading the Torah is realizing that in every step of civilization, people become more free and more responsible. As God's visibility becomes more and more hidden from us, the need to recognize God's ways and emulate them becomes more and more necessary. There would be some benefits to, for example, living in the time by the Exodus and being set up for success by God at every turn. When submission is required, success is easier. But in our time, when people are more free and more responsible, the stakes are higher. In one sense, this means that our good deeds are really done out of a desire to bring about goodness. But it also means that humans are more capable of doing atrocious things, knowing there won't be immediate and direct divine retribution. Being given some of the godly power of being responsible for the world's justice is not something to take lightly. We should wear it as a badge of honor, not for vanity, but as a reminder of our ability to leverage our power for good. Dear friends, Shabbat Shalom.